Welcome to One-on-One. I'm Mike Orkin, and today our guest is an author, a teacher, and a therapist. His name is Dan Beaver. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
So, your specialty is marriage and sex.
Correct.
You teach a class, Cal State Hayward, called Marriage and Sex.
Sociology of marriage and sex.
Uh-huh.
Right.
You also teach over at DVC. You teach a class on human sexuality, and you've written books on the topic. You're a marriage and family therapist, and you deal with that topic with clients
All the time.
all the time. You're also a former graduate of Cal State Hayward.
Correct.
Let's start out talking about your course that you offer here in the sociology department called Marriage and Sex. Now that's sort of a provocative sounding title, especially the sex part, and I'm sure it's very popular. In fact, I know it's popular among students here. It's a very highly enrolled class.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the topics that you cover in that class.
Well, the main topic, I always say, is the subject of intimacy. And that's pretty the guts of the class. And intimacy, for most people, they always think sex when they hear intimacy, but actually there's three types of intimacy that I deal with. One is that you gotta love yourself. It's all about self-esteem. And then there's something called emotional intimacy, and then sexual intimacy. So it's like a three-part series, so to speak.
Uh-huh. So by emotional intimacy, you mean emotional intimacy with your partners or with your friends, or
no, with your partner.
With your partner.
Yeah, because usually, the class is in the context of marriage, and it's about how people are emotionally involved and how they stay and can keep that involvement. Because for a lot of people in long-term relationships, they become distant. So it's how to keep that connection alive.
Now, there are a lot of people, especially college students, who have serious relationships, but they're not married.
Right.
So
it doesn't, it applies regardless if they're married or not. Intimacy is intimacy, whether they're married or living together. But, since sociology covers the institutions of society, marriage is one of them, as well as the institution of the family. So that's why it was used marriage, but it applies across the board.
Yeah. Let's start out with the first topic on your list, namely intimacy with yourself. What exactly does that mean, besides being, well, you just have to sort of accept yourself? Well,
I would say you need to, intimacy with yourself means that what you feel internally is the same as what you express or project externally. And for a lot of people, we can't be open about how we feel, so we're not intimate in the world. It's not safe. But you need to be able to do that in your personal life. Like if someone drinks all the time, they're not sober, you can't be intimate with them because they're really not there. So if you're disconnected with yourself, how can you get involved with someone else, basically? So that's first base. And there's that phrase, you have to love yourself before you can love somebody else, very psychobabble. And loving yourself means that you care and respect your own emotions. Because if you don't, then whoever your partner probably won't either, because you allow them to run over you, essentially. So it's about self-validation about your own emotions. They have to matter to you. It's about setting boundaries between you and another person. Learning how to do that, saying, I'm not comfortable with this, and that's where you draw the line. You can't do that, and you get in a relationship, you get engulfed.
So you mean being comfortable with telling your partner, I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable talking about this,
or doing this, or
doing this,
whatever
right.
it is. And a lot of people end up doing things they're not comfortable doing, and then they don't feel good about themselves, and then they want out.
Now, there are different types of relationships. Does this sort of apply to the various types? I know you said that you really talk about the intimate types of relationships.
Committed. I think the key word is, is committed.
So someone who maybe, let's say, you have a close friend, that the same rules don't apply.
No, don't apply. No, I'm not talking about friendships or casual dating or. This is a one-on-one committed situation where they're trying to get intimately involved. That's the focus of the class.
But there is this. There are. It's interesting. There are people whom you meet who are your friends or who you just meet casually or at work, who you think act sort of distant, and who just seem sort of detached from having any kind of personal conversation. And there are other people who, 10 minutes after you meet them, they're talking about their personal lives.
Right.
How does that? So there seem to be, to me anyway, as a layman and not someone well versed in the subject matter, different sort of personality types of just people and how they interact with the world. Does that sort of affect I mean, are there these different personality
Sure.
types, and do these different personality types respond differently with with the types of things
you
that
could
you
have,
teach?
like, yeah, I don't dwell on personality types because it's much more in psychology. I mean, but you're right, you can have an introverted person and an extroverted, and they interpersonally relate differently. But the skills are the same, regardless of
Okay.
personality.
I guess that's what I was driving at.
Yeah, the dynamics are the same in terms of how you do stuff.
So it's not easy to be, especially if you have some problem that you're maybe not willing to share. Do you have some tips or some ways of dealing of sort of developing these skills? Still on the first topic.
Well, that's what the class is about,
Yeah.
is developing those skills. Because I kind of work from the premise that in our culture, we're not taught how to have a long-lasting, intimate relationship. Some people believe you shouldn't even have to have a class like this, that it should just work out naturally. And so the class is very pragmatic in that sense, where I teach the skills on how to resolve conflicts, how to communicate emotions constructively, how to listen, some very pragmatic things. So I think the difference in this class is that it's very pragmatic. I'm not into a lot of theories and it's very down to earth kind of stuff.
Well, you mentioned something that's interesting to me, and that is that in our culture we're not, we're not really expected to have a lifelong partnership necessarily. Divorce rates are high, but don't these skills apply even if you think you have a committed relationship, but even in a sort of maybe a less strict culture than one in which you are supposed to stay with someone for the rest of your life?
Well, I think that the skills help up the odds of that, but don't guarantee it. But most people are thrown into a relationship with no skills,
Right.
except for what they vaguely learned as children. And so, to me, that's why the divorce rate is what it is, because people have that option and they don't have the ability to make it really a good experience, so they opt out, a lot of people.
So you think that just generally people, I mean, this is somewhat of a controversial topic, that some people will make the claim that, well, if you're in a relationship and you're not getting along with your partner for whatever reason, things are drifting apart in some way or another. Maybe it's personal, maybe it's professional, maybe there are a whole host of reasons.
Right.
You have very differences in philosophy that you should just get out of the relationship. But you're saying that really maybe if you develop the necessary skills for intimacy, you wouldn't have to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's some places where people are just not compatible because of their differences in style.
Yeah, so they just got into something that wasn't meant
I'm not
to be.
saying, but for a lot of people, the reason they leave is not because of that. They leave because they're not intimate, because they're not emotionally involved, and it's unfulfilling.
Okay, so you're not saying that everybody should. You're not saying that there can't be genuine incompatibilities.
Oh no, definitely not. I mean, you have value differences. People want different things in their lives, and they're just not. It's not that, but that's not usually what I find as a professional. Why people are unhappy in their relationships. They're unhappy because they become roommates instead of lovers over time for all kinds of reasons.
I see. So there are lots of people in your experience who are maybe splitting up or about to, or at least not getting along very well, not because they're genuinely incompatible, just because they don't have these skills at being intimate.
Right. And as a consequence, the relationship's breaking down. And it used to be people just put up with it. I mean, before there was divorce and people had that option, they just put up with it, and grin and bear it. And now they have the option.
Right.
But it doesn't mean just because you go to another relationship, it's going to be all great too. Just a lot of repeating the pattern.
Right. Well, let's talk about some of your clients, because you spend some time teaching, but you also
Most of the time
spend a great deal of your time
Therapy,
in therapy. So
Right.
what types of people do you see? Who comes to see a marriage and family therapist?
Everybody. I don't know that there's a specific type. I tend to work primarily with suburban couples, usually around 35 to 45 years old. Usually been married about 10 years, 2 nice kids, nice house, nice everything, and they're not happy. It's not the stereotype of very mentally disturbed. It means that everybody's neighbor kind of thing.
Right. So it's just sort of what people who have every reason to be happy, but somehow aren't, and
they're coming to see why that is. They're depressed, or they're frustrated, or fearful they're going to break up, or Somebody had an affair, that's another big presenting problem.
So how do they find out about you? I mean, how do they decide, well, we've got to see a therapist?
Me specifically?
Well, both. The first step, what makes them decide, okay, this has gone too far, we have to go see a marriage therapist?
Because they don't want to go to the lawyer. So I'm the alternative to the lawyer. 'Cause they don't want to stop seeing their kids. They don't want to split up their equity in their house. They don't want to go there. So they see this as an alternative and a hope that that's something that can be avoided. The stigma of going to see a therapist is very much removed as it was when I started 27 years ago. It's nothing like that. It's like, yeah, we need help, and both men and women are more prone to go there.
As a professional, so how do people find out about you? I mean,
Well, word of mouth.
referrals.
Yeah, definitely word of mouth. I mean, after so many years in one community, you get known, and if you're good, people tell their friends, and blah blah blah, like that.
And go ahead.
And also the books I wrote, people read the books and then they want to come see me, or I speak in the community that brings people in.
So now, as a marriage and family therapist, what about people who are having problems that if they went to see a psychiatrist would be treated by antidepressants or something like that? Do you refer them? Do you just not? Do you think that your skills? I mean, so people who have genuine psychological problems must be among the mix who come
Sure.
and see you.
If someone is depressed, I would definitely refer them to a psychiatrist for medical evaluation and and take some type of antidepressants. But that's not the answer. I mean, that's just that's a help. Then you deal with the more day-to-day realities and the way they think and the way they interact. But it's helpful.
Right. Now, you mentioned your books, so I want to talk about those, but first we have to take a break.
Okay.
Come back. We're talking with Dan Beaver, who is a marriage and family therapist and also a teacher of various courses, including marriage and sex, here at the Sociology Department at Cal State Hayward. Dan, also, you're an author.
Right.
You've written a couple books on the topic, and one is called Beyond the Marriage Fantasy.
Right.
The other is called More Than Just Sex. So tell us a little bit about your books.
Well, the first book I started writing in about 1980, and it's been out quite a while, and basically deals with the subject of emotional intimacy. And the marriage fantasy refers to everybody's belief on what a marriage is supposed to be like, and then they try to live it out, and then it doesn't work out, and then the rest of the book is how to make it better. The second book deals primarily with the subject of human sexuality. It deals with how to maintain a long-lasting, great sexual relationship, all the things that go into that. I was also trained as a sex therapist and have done that for years, so that book is about what I do in sex therapy.
So now these books are
Required reading in all my classes.
Okay, required reading in your classes. So students, college students, read these books.
Right.
And then what about your clients who come in? Do you give them copies of your books? So
Yeah, some do, some don't. I mean, that's not a critical thing, but a lot of them do.
But the books are you were mentioning earlier in our discussion that your class was not just some theoretical gobbledygook, but it was an actual practical class in which people learn skills of how to deal with it properly.
Day to day, yeah. Because when I was in school, everything had to be relevant. And I try to make my classes relevant and not. I'm not the traditional sociology teacher that I had at Cal that talks about studies and surveys and statistics. That I'm more into like this is what happens and how to make it better.
So this is what if this happens to you, here's what you should do.
Right, because my clinical research is done in my office with people day to day. So that's what I bring into my classroom. So I'm kind of different that way.
So your books, I assume, have the same sort of focus.
Yes,
same
there's
flavor.
Not a lot of quoting and studies and
philosophical jargon.
Yeah, it's very straight to the point.
It's just here are some skills and here's how to learn them.
Exactly.
Your books are available. I know they're available here at the bookstore at Cal State Hayward. Are they also available online, like at Amazon.com or something like that?
I think so. More Than Just Sex is definitely. Beyond the Marriage Fantasy is going through I'm rewriting it right now, and it's not as available. But it is here at the school. But
in your class here, Marriage and Sex, and I guess your class at Diablo Valley College, Human Sexuality, is sort of similar. How do the sex issue is probably sensitive to some students, and maybe even more sensitive to their parents.
Definitely.
And there's this climate in this country right now of well, there are a lot of legitimate worries about AIDS and things like that, but also there's this climate of teaching abstinence instead of protection and stuff like that. Do you get much criticism? How do you deal with that in your class? I shouldn't ask too many questions at once.
Yeah. I've pretty much walked the fine line. I've not really had a lot of flack in getting. I try to respect people's values. Sex is a very value-loaded subject. People have strong beliefs about it. I tend to not speak in areas that I don't have experience with, like homosexuality. I mean, I bring in, gay speakers. So I don't know. It's been pretty good as far as avoiding a lot of problems. But because I talk about the psychology and the sociology of it, and the thing I talk about that they don't teach us in school is how to have sexual pleasure, on a psychological level. We learned all about how babies are made and how not to have babies and everything about reproduction. And in my class, I don't even talk about reproduction because I assume they've all learned that already. What I talk about is all the things that get in the way of pleasure. And our culture doesn't really teach us much about that. So people are really receptive to that if I can teach it in a respectable, clinical kind of way and not be really off the wall with it, which some schools I've heard where, they have problems like that, where they get a little too on the fringe. So, I'm used to talking to the, middle America. I mean, that's conservative values,
So how do you deal with pleasure? I mean, how do you admit pleasure into your intimate life?
Well, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of attitudes that don't support that we're brought up with. We're a very work-oriented society, and just giving ourselves permission to have pleasure is a big step. So I talk about how we're programmed to work, and the idea of play and relaxation is kind of alien almost.
Well, actually, I find that very interesting because I get into the situation where I'm really loaded down with work and have just lots of projects going on and stuff, and it's hard for me to let go when I get home. So give me a couple of tips. What do I do to...
Well, I mean, in terms of sexuality?
No, just in terms of, the first step is just to be able to, I guess, let go, thinking about, let's see, how do I put together this business plan, or how do I...
Okay, well, you want to focus on something else. You can't just say, I don't want to think about work, for instance. You got to say, I don't want to think about work, I want to focus on this, and whatever this is has got to be pleasurable. So you can't just tell somebody, well, just relax and kick back and don't worry about it.
Right. I mean, it's impossible to just...
No, you got to have your focus.
To tell yourself, I don't want to think about such and such, because then you'll start thinking about it, even if you weren't.
So it's like selective attention. You have to change your focus to something that gives you pleasure, and not focus on the other stuff. And that's the key. What gives you pleasure? And for some people, that's hard to figure out, because to them, pleasure means working out, always doing.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. So how? What if you think that if to you pleasure means working? How do you shift the focus then?
Well, see, I was taught you should always be producing something, achieving, accomplishing.
Right. Yeah. That's what I
learned,
too.
and so for me to sit still on the beach and not produce and achieve, I started getting anxious and like, this is a waste of time.
Right.
And then I learned that.
I know that feeling well.
And so what I learned was that just sitting there is doing something. It's recharging. It's giving myself a gift, the pleasure of just freeing my mind of that. And so it's like recharging my batteries, so then I can go back and produce better. But I had to get off that, I'm not accomplishing anything.
But do you have to, it must be something, I know exactly what you're saying, because I find myself in that situation rather often, if I even manage to get to the beach.
Well, your bedroom is, the same thing. It's the same concept.
But do you have to practice at it? Do you have to do it like you're learning, when you're learning a skill, you have to practice it?
Yeah, I think it doesn't just like a light switch and all of a sudden you're different. Right. You got to work at that, and it's just changing attitudes. So a lot of what I do is help people change behavior and attitudes. In my work, I believe that those are the two things that can change, because they're all learned, and we have a lot of unlearning to do.
Right, and so it's just a matter of
giving yourself permission, just saying it's okay not to finish everything. That was another attitude. If you start something, you got to finish it.
Right.
Well, in our lives, there's no way you're going to do that. And so I say, okay, I've done enough now. I can put it down and go have fun. See, if I was a kid, my mother said, no, you got to get back out there until it's finished.
Right.
You can't start playing until you finish all your work. Well,
Right.
when you're, older and you got a house and kids, there's no way you're going to finish everything.
Right.
So if you do that, you'll never relax, There's no time.
So so you find that particular difficulty in being able to just permit yourself to have pleasure and to drop the work part
Spills into our sex lives, big
yeah.
time.
And so that probably is something that your clients have
Struggle
trouble
with. Right. And so as a consequence of that, sexual frequency tanks. That's probably the biggest sexual problem today is people is low sexual frequency because they're always working. They're commuting. They're working these crazy hours. They got kids. And so by the time they get to bed, they're exhausted.
Right.
And then they wonder why they don't have a sex life. Now, 20 years ago, it may not have been like that because the lifestyles were really different.
So it's not but what you're saying is that even though you may have a hectic schedule, if you can just learn to give yourself permission at the end of the day to just sort of drop it till tomorrow, then you can still enjoy yourself in other ways.
Which goes all the way back to the very beginning of learning to love yourself, which has to do with giving yourself pleasure, It's nurturing yourself. People tend to take care of others and nurture, but do they take care of themselves?
Right.
See?
So that brings up an interesting point. Back at the beginning, you mentioned 3 areas: 1, loving yourself; 2, emotional intimacy; and 3, sexual intimacy. I take it from our conversation, and tell me if I'm wrong, that these 3 things are intimately linked, so to speak, and that you can't really forget about one and then be successful with the others.
Exactly, and they develop in a progression. First the self, then the emotional, then the sexual.
So that's how you deal with it in your class.
Exactly. Right. The first section is the self, and then the emotional and the sexual. But they always want to get to the sex first, though.
Right.
They always cut to the chase. No, that's later. We got to do this first.
Now, when you're dealing with clients, you have a couple sitting in an office, and you can really deal with them in a so-called in an intimate way, so to speak, and really work with them. But when you have a class of 50 students,
100.
it really is a popular class. But yes, I know it is. When you have a class of 100 students, how do you give personal attention to
I don't. I tell them this class isn't therapy in that sense. I'm not going to get into their personal lives, and that's for my office. In the class, it's just learning the intellectual concepts and beliefs that I believe that everybody should learn, ideally, before they get into a marriage. So it's the intellectual, cognitive part, as we say. And it's not about, they take it and apply it to their personal lives. But no, I don't get into all their personal stuff there.
Okay,
of course,
so
they're being impacted greatly, but there's not a lot of interchange.
Right. So if a student comes to your office hour and says, "My boyfriend and I,"
well, that they might do.
Okay, and you're willing to talk to them about.
Yeah, that's not a problem. But not in the
classroom.
No. It gets to be a free for all if I got into that.
Right.
And there's not enough time.
Right. So you said you're rewriting Beyond the Marriage Fantasy
Yeah.
To reflect changes in culture over the last 20 years?
Changes in culture, changes in me, things that I've learned, new stuff. It's always developing, and so it needs to be updated.
If someone wants to get a hold of you, is there a phone number or website?
No, there's a number, 925-876-HELP.
Okay.
That'd be easy. 876-HELP.
Okay. So you teach this class, Marriage and Sex, once a year, more often?
Well, usually every summer.
Every summer.
Yeah, because and then in the fall I teach at the junior college, DVC and LMC.
Okay. Well, really interesting stuff. We've run out of time now.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Dan Beaver, author, instructor, and marriage and family therapist.